Okay, here we go.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the session on COVID contributions and the post-mask ask. I had to practice saying that one about 10 times before I stopped completely tripping over it. A big thank you to Dave and Margaret and the entire Unfunded team for hosting this. I think there's been a series of important conversations already. And we're hoping that this contributes to that conversation and advances it. My name is George Tsiatis. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of the Resolution Project. We fund, mentor, and support young people starting social enterprises in their home communities around the world. And so in an average year through my organization, I see about 500 proposals. And so there are a number of those that get funded, and there are a number of those that are unfunded. And so a few years ago, when I had the chance to participate as an unfunded list evaluator, I was thrilled to do that because a big principle for our organization is that no one should leave an application process with nothing to show for it. The opportunity to either get funded and get support or get feedback was a critical piece there. So I'm a big believer in the work that the Unfunded List does, and I think that that a lot of the conversations that have been going on that have been advancing this idea of moving out of sort of a zero-sum framework as much as possible have been really valuable and have the opportunity to move a space that moves people. So in terms of this conversation, there's a bit of a prompt here about, sort of how we have adapted in the time of COVID and where we go from here, how we sort of there's the bigger question of like how we all reintegrate ourselves into an in-person society after so much time behind computer screens. We're hoping to really dig into this from the fundraising perspective. A big part of my work in running this roughly $3 million a year organization is to make sure that we make that budget and to go out and make the asks. I can tell you that in the past year and a half, all of the traditional modes of fundraising that I had utilized changed, and just from conversations with our two distinguished panelists, Ashley and Sarah, who I'll let introduce themselves in a moment. It seems like that was the experience across the board, that we were all pushed to adapt pretty quickly. And maybe the thing that we're not discussing as much as we should is that we're going to be asked to adapt pretty rapidly again. And that's whether we go to, sort of more hybrid modes, if we find ourselves in a different stage of the pandemic, if we find ourselves in different geographies with different restrictions and norms in this current climate. It's a lot that's going to change, and this is a chance really for us to have a conversation about what it's meant, where we see it going. And of course, also to take questions on what's on your mind and get the perspective of these two quite accomplished and distinguished individuals. So with that, I'm pleased to note that we're joined by Ashley Lahoud, who's an Unfunded List board member and the development director at the Northside Center in Harlem, and also by Sarah McIntosh, who serves on the Governance and Advancement Committee of the Unfunded List, and also works as the Director of Foundation Relations at Mary Center in DC. And I am deeply jealous of the fact that you were there in person, Sarah. So Ashley, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Sarah, go ahead, and then maybe share just in a brief couple of sentences what it means to you to be a fundraiser and why you're involved with the Unfunded List as well.
Okay, as part of our introduction, you want us to say that? Okay,
yes,
no
please.
problem. Okay, great. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I have been with the Unfunded List, I think probably for 4 or 5 years. I've been in development for about 20 years. Like so many of us, I completely fell into fundraising. I don't think anybody really knew about fundraising growing up or, dreamt about becoming a fundraiser. But I was 18 years old. I was living in New York and going to school here, and I wanted to be a writer. And I saw an ad in the print edition of the New York Times that a place called the Foundation Center needed a part-time editorial assistant. And it was a few blocks from my dorm room. So I got the job. And for a couple of years, I was basically helping my friends on the side as what now you would call a grant evaluator, reviewing their grant proposals for free and telling them why they weren't getting funded. So after a few years of doing that, I realized that I could have a great career as a fundraiser. And so I have, and I really love it. And I guess I'm still helping people doing the same thing through my work as a board member on the Unfunded List. So what it means to me to be a fundraiser, it means a lot of things. But essentially, I think that it means I'm connecting people, sometimes corporations, foundations, who have the means to invest in problems or causes that are significant with the institutions that have the ability and the on-the-ground knowledge to affect those issues and to bring about social change on the ground. Was there another part to the question, George? Did I forget something?
I think you've covered everything.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much. Sarah, take it away.
So funnily enough, I also got my start in fundraising through the Foundation Center in New York, but by way of doing research for a very small nonprofit. It was a remote position. I was working from home with my parents in New Jersey and would go into New York City and go to the Foundation Center and do research on prospective funders for this organization. And throughout my time in undergrad at American University, I held a number of positions doing grant writing, grant research, and fundraising logistics for a number of small nonprofits in DC. Actually worked for Dave as his intern about 10 years ago, so we go pretty far back. And then right out of undergrad, worked for a foundation for about 3 years, first as a grants administrator and then as a program officer, and then switched back to fundraising at Mary's Center, started as the manager of foundation relations and have now worked my way up to director of grants and foundation relations, overseeing all of our grant fundraising. What fundraising means to me is really having the opportunity to give back to the community and have an impact. Mary Center serves over 60,000 individuals in the Washington, D.C. region, and I know that the work that I do every day helps us to deliver on our mission, deliver our programs, and meet the needs of a changing community. And I've been evaluating with the Unfunded List since 2016.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. And I think there's a fourth member of the panel here, which I haven't really yet acknowledged, which is all of those of you that are participating. So we do hope this can be an interactive session, and that you'll be sure to drop questions into the chat as they do come up. So focusing really on the first part of the title of this session, right? COVID contributions. I think certainly my experience was that things changed pretty much overnight. We didn't have a lot of time to adapt. There was some day in the second week of March last year when basically we realized we weren't going to be going into our offices in all likelihood, and for a little while. And then sometime, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, we mostly realized it might be a very long time before we see people face to face again. In some cases, we had large fundraising events scheduled already. And so, Ashley, I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit about, sort of the gala that you've had at the Plaza for years and what the experience was like, realizing that that was not going to happen.
Sure. So our gala has always been just our primary fundraiser. And in the past few years, we've had it at the Plaza, but we've also had it at other really big, iconic New York hotels, places like the Pier, and we've sold out. So we're talking about, 500 or so people in the room, and you can't even, walk from one table to another. Everybody's like this. And not only that, frankly, a lot of our donors are elderly. And so at the time, we had another huge gala planned, and we raised about well over $1 million in unrestricted revenue through this. And suddenly, we need to become experts on something that nobody but, the most specific lawyer knows about, called force majeure. I said, what's force majeure? We've never learned about this before. But then in a couple of weeks, everybody's learning about this. So, the hotel worked with us. All the venues, I think worked with their clients, because nothing could be held. This was basically an act of God. Nothing could be held. And long story short, they worked with us. I think everything I've heard, other venues worked with other clients, because nobody was trying to, screw over their clients in the midst of a pandemic. But it was very scary. We had to switch to a virtual format. We did not raise as much money as we had originally projected, and it was much more work. And in the course of about 5 weeks, I had to go from working with our event planner to basically planning a very big, very fancy party in person, to being a video producer, which is something I had never done before. We had to get all this film, all this stuff produced, despite the fact that there were very few people who could come on site. Some of it was archival, some of it was animated. We had to be very, very creative. Some of it was filmed remotely. We had to create the entire thing virtually, and then we had to do it again for 2021, and we did meet our goal. We did meet our original projected goal, and now for the year ahead, we're seeing what 2022 would look like, but it could be hybrid. So basically, we had to turn on a dime, and it was very difficult. A lot of work, but looking back, it was something to be very proud of.
Oh, absolutely. Beneath all of that, there's sort of a number of things that make a pivot like that possible. And I think you hinted at the importance of developing multimedia quickly, and of telling stories in a way that's going to engage people online. But I imagine also there was some fundraising strategy that adapted as well around who was being asked for what, and how to go out to people and focus it. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about some of the strategy that helped, especially drive meeting your goals this year, because I think last year there was some novelty, and I know in our case we were able to lean on some big donors a little bit more than in prior years, and that helped us sort of keep pace. But after having sort of a year of working through this, we actually bumped into more people with Zoom fatigue and maybe a little less willingness to show up, even if they were still going to write a check. What were some of the strategic pieces that you utilized this year to help hit those? Yeah.
To help offset that. Well, so then for 2020, we had originally planned to have more honorees. And then we ended up only having one. We decided to just be a little bit more strategic about using some of our honorees. So then that stretches out sort of the fundraising, power. So then for 2021, we had 3 honorees. So then there's more co-chairs, more people you could ask, so on and so forth. So that was one way to get more support for this year.
That's terrific. And, I know we've each discussed, and I expect we'll cover some bit about this later, but I think both of our organizations were able to take advantage of the PPP loans that were available. But Sarah, I know that wasn't an option for your organization. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you adapted, especially when some of those things that were supposed to hold together organizations that were most vulnerable, how you managed to steer through this.
Yeah, so I think it's a common misconception that all nonprofits were able to benefit from the PPP loans. Mary Center and other community health centers like us, who have a staff of more than 500 people, were not eligible for the PPP loans, nor were we eligible for a lot of the other state and local government support that was offered last year, just due to the sheer size of our workforce. And it's really a shame, because we were the ones on the front lines in the community doing the testing, providing the care to people who were sick, and really responding to the needs of the community during the pandemic. So for me, I work in institutional fundraising, and typically the way revenue comes through the door, it's kind of through a set opportunity, right? It's either a renewal, it's an open RFP, or it's an invitation to submit a proposal. And when I had to adapt last March, I had to sit down and figure out how to meet the emerging needs of my organization pretty much from scratch in an unprecedented space. We have diversified revenue streams at Mary Center, and we generate about 70% of our revenue through patient billing. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were huge losses in medical encounters. Dental particularly was decimated. There are certain encounter types that could be converted to telehealth, but dental's one where there's not much you can do in the telehealth space. So we were facing really millions of dollars in revenue losses and having to fill those gaps. And in the meantime, having to pivot our operations, having to purchase PPE, purchase cleaning supplies, administer testing to the community, really pivot to meet the needs of our community. So I sat down and really racked my brain as to who in our supporter network we could reach out to. And it was really a matter of picking up the phone, making phone calls to our institutional supporters and saying, hey, the needs of our community have changed this year. The needs of our organization have changed this year. Would you be open to giving us some additional support to meet the needs of this crisis? And it was really a very relational and very individualized approach to fundraising that is typically not how you go about grant fundraising, but was really the most effective way of filling in the gaps that we were facing in order to continue to meet the needs of the community.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I had a similar experience where sort of old-fashioned picking up the phone and having a conversation with folks was particularly well received in the time. And I think as soon as it became apparent what was going on, I think my reaction was, oh my God, I'm worried we're going to lose a lot of donors. And the actual experience was that when asked, I found that the vast majority of people were willing to do more. And as long as that ask was individualized and connected to them. And that was, honestly, it gave me a lot of optimism through the entire pandemic to see people stepping up and helping out in numerous ways, not just with the Resolution Project, but with many, many other organizations that rely on public donations. But I guess the thing that sort of left me with was the strategic challenge of constantly and effectively communicating with people when you don't have chances to see them in person. And when a lot of relationships are more or less sort of stuck in neutral, right? The ability to sort of grow or expand relationships is particularly challenging during this time. Something that I did was I started a sort of from the desk of the CEO type letter that really did a deep dive into what was going on in the organization and where we could use help or assistance and where we had, sort of interesting activities going on. I wonder if there were any sort of elements around the communications that you use to stay connected and to steward people through this time and to stay connected with them that you might be willing to share.
Yeah, sure. So traditionally, we really rely on the ability to build relationships in person, particularly as a health center serving the community. We can bring our donors in and give them site tours and show them firsthand the impact of a contribution, which is a really powerful thing to be able to do. But due to COVID, we lost that ability of, being able to host someone for a site tour. And like you said, we had to pivot and find other ways to communicate. So similar to you, we set up a newsletter that went out from our CEO to all of our major donors and supporters, keeping them up to date on our work, on the changes we were seeing in the community, on how we were addressing those needs, and that went out on a fairly regular basis. We also hosted a few supporter town halls where we would invite all of our supporters and donors to a big Zoom call with our CEO and other members of our leadership, where they could hear them speak about the needs in the community and ask questions.
Thanks, Sarah. Ashley, anything to add on that?
No, I mean, we pretty much, we did similar things. We reached out a lot to the board and to others in our network. We also actually did a move to a new site during this time. So what we're starting to do now is actually invite people to site visits on a very sort of limited basis. So we are bringing back the in-person visit, and that's a really good opportunity. So that's what we're moving toward on a really personal basis for the year ahead, the fiscal year ahead.
Great, thanks for that, Ashley. You're respectively in the fields of health and in education. These are very, very large causes and areas of giving for sort of within the fundraising sphere overall. I wonder if you can situate us a bit in this moment when these were two sectors that were so, or two, I guess, issue areas that were so immediately and acutely relevant during this time. There was, everybody of course was looking for ways to support health initiatives, but at the same time that sort of rush creates a lot of confusion. I wonder if you can share a little bit of how you navigated your place within those areas and the moment, really.
Well, for example, one funder provided support relative to bridge programming, summer programming for kids as they got ready for the new school year, with a focus on kids that were going from one level to another. So from elementary to middle school, or middle school to high school, and so on. And it was very effective in some ways, and then in other ways, completely unrealistic. And there were, a lot of us who were beneficiaries of this support, and we were grateful, but we had a working group that all came together, and we did, sort of speak to the foundation about the fact that what we really need right now is general operating support, because while the funder had the right idea and all the policy groups behind this had the right idea, even the DOE is saying that the problem right now of kids returning to school and getting ready for in-person school is so big, and there are so many issues right now regarding, socialization and all of the issues that children are facing, that a few grants given to education nonprofits are not going to solve the problem. And what we really need right now is unrestricted support. So I think that one of the ways that we're navigating this is that a lot of those conversations that have been issues in the sector for a really long time, like the need for more unrestricted support, are now becoming, much more timely. And I think our unrestricted support probably doubled last year as a result of that. And some funders are now saying, no, we're not going to continue to give general operating grants. You have to go back to requesting program support, and others are not. They're keeping their support unrestricted. So that's an example of, I think, how we navigated our place.
Yeah, I would add to that from my experience, I feel like the philanthropic community really understood that in a crisis, restrictions needed to be loosened, strings needed to be untightened. We were contacted by a number of funders who would say, oh, we're waiving reporting requirements. We don't want an extra burden to you during this time. Or we know that these funds were designated for this specific program, but if you need to repurpose them for other things, including general operating support, that's completely fine. And like Ashley said, I think some funders have really recognized, okay, this was an effective strategy and we can trust these organizations to use the funds however they need to. And hopefully that will become the new norm moving forward. But I think there are also a lot who really have pivoted back to this idea of, okay, we need to have reporting requirements and all the structure and all of these rules.
Yeah, so those are, two pretty incredible trends. I think things that organizations have been politely stomping their feet about for some time. And it was, probably of course, a terrible situation that ended up being the one to advance it. But ultimately, it does put us closer to direct, sort of a better pathway. At the same time, you always wonder how long these things will hold up for, how long these trends will last for. And so, before we jump into the post-mask ask component of the title, I did also want to and invite one of our audience members, Jennifer Fusco, maybe to share a little bit about what it was like working for public radio during this time, when information is at such a premium, when the challenges around misinformation were tremendous and terrifying, but also where it's sort of one of the most traditional modes of fundraising out there. What was it like to make a transition during this time?
Yeah, well, so at WUNC, we also host a lot of in-person events, and those, of course, have still been put on hold for the most part. And now we thought we were maybe coming to a point where that was about to change, and with the news lately of Delta variant, we're sort of taking a pause, as I think everyone is. But so the challenges, kind of echoing what the folks here have already said, the panelists have already said, that when we talk with donors about the specific need, they wanted to support it. As you mentioned, George, the news was more important than ever. Fact-based news was more important than ever. And especially supporters, listeners who'd already come to know, trust, and rely on WUNC and NPR nationally, understood the importance of that previously in their life, and it just became that much more important, during this time of pandemic. So that was helpful to the ask. As far as events, we did so many in-person events, and as I mentioned, had to cancel some that were already in the works and not plan others that we held every year. But we did jump to doing some virtual events. This was mentioned too. And that was the interesting thing that we learned from that is we'll probably continue doing some virtual events, even when we've fully returned to back in person, because we had a mix of people who were not interested, people who were sometimes interested, and others who were very interested and who never came to any in-person events before, but could now participate in a way they weren't able to. I mean, we're also an organization, this may be true of others, that we cover a wide geographic area. So there were some people who love what we do, but were never able to be with us in person because of distance. So or other things that might limit them, driving at night, that kind of thing. So it's been an interesting experience, and we have had a lot of takeaways from it as well. Like I said, we'll probably continue to do some virtual aspect, even as we're also hearing from people who can't wait to get back to in person. So.
Yeah, well, we have a global community at Resolution, so it's been great to be able to pull in folks, and it certainly expanded our idea of what is possible and what works for an event. There was a question on in the chat here, I think that ties into the point that you were sharing, Ashley, about having raised twice as much in terms of general operating unrestricted funds. About whether Mackenzie Scott's donations had an influence on other funders. What's your take on that?
Not yet.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I think we haven't seen a lot of trends yet with some of the biggest and most established foundations. Until they move, it's difficult to see it being completely normalized across the space. I would note that a program that we partnered with, which came out of the Roddenberry Foundation as a rapid response program, did really try to push the envelope on this, and so it's called the +1 Global Fund. And they tapped into networks like the Resolution Project, like some of the State Department's initiatives, like the Acumen Fund and their fellowship program, and a number of other organizations. And the whole premise of it was twofold. They would use those networks of networks to identify social entrepreneurs doing incredible on-the-ground work that were off their radar, right? That were extensions of these networks. And so basically asking social entrepreneurs who they think locally are doing the best work. And then they were giving $15,000 grants to the person who they were ultimately awarding. And they were giving $2,500 referral grants to the folks who had identified them. But my favorite part about it was that it was no application. You just needed to be nominated. You were invited. If you wanted to submit additional materials, you could, but they asked that it not be something that you prepare specifically for it. They were happy to just look up whatever information was out there on you. So they were taking on a research function and absorbing that responsibility. There were no restrictions on the use of the funds. It was entirely up to you how you needed it to respond to use it in response to COVID in your community. And the third piece was no reporting. You were invited optionally to send in whatever information you wanted to, whether it was a short narrative paragraph or nothing at all. And what they found was that generally people just provided a few links along with their nomination to things that they've already prepared that identified what it is that they do. They put the money to work in the most ingenious ways, where they didn't have to explain themselves or convince someone that it was the best use of those funds. And they got reporting in a number of different formats but people were all too happy to talk about what they had accomplished without having a, sort of a forced structure. And whether that was a story about one life that they impacted deeply, or it was, numerical and financial data, they all told different stories that were meaningful, and the report rate was probably higher than most other organizations get with that volume of grants. So,
Wow.
Hopefully there will be an additional push on this to bring it back to Anne's question, but I don't think we've realized that quite yet. So shifting gears towards the post-mask ask. What do you think the trends are going to be moving forward? How do you think, we're seeing entire workplaces being completely restructured. Relationships have been restructured, and certainly in professional contexts. Where do you see this going, and how are you thinking about, whether it's the next 6 months, if you're, if you're leaning towards the more optimistic side, or let's call it in the next 12 to 24 months, if you're maybe a little less optimistic. How are you thinking about the future where we can meet face to face, whether we have masks on or don't, but where we are meeting face to face? How are you thinking about it and preparing for that time? Sarah, you want to kick us off on this one?
Sure. So I think for me, it's really a hybrid approach, which applies to a lot of things these days. So I've mentioned that pre-COVID, we would bring our funders in to do site visits, give them really a personal experience, seeing our work in action and the impact that a contribution would have. And, definitely eager to go back to that in-person component and being able to give our funders that really direct exposure to our work. But at the same time, that comes with a lot of scheduling, logistics, travel. And I have found that when you're just meeting with people on the phone or over Teams or Zoom, it's a lot easier to set things up. So you can have really more frequent touch points with your funders because you don't have to deal with those in-person logistics and scheduling and all of that. So I think really moving forward a hybrid approach that allows those frequent touch points, but also paired with bringing back that in-person interaction is the direction that we'd go in. And, obviously have to be mindful of other people's comfort levels and are they ready to come back in person? Just because we're able to offer that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to be at that comfort level right away.
Ashley, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Sarah said. I mean, we're definitely seeing that, some people do prefer the in-person approach. Myself, I actually prefer being in the office. I was getting sick of being home. And so I prefer being out, and I think some people like that too. I think that hybrid for the foreseeable future is here to stay, and that there's going to be some real growing pains with that, because at a minimum, that means more work and more money. It means we're going to be paying for some element of doing things in person, some element of the labor of doing things in person, and the same for the remote version of it. But what I have also seen is that remote in many ways makes things more accessible to people. There are people who, maybe now you're able to reach donors in another part of the world, or people who might have some reasons for not leaving the house, or whatever the case may be, who now you can interact with, who you wouldn't have been able to do with that beautiful plaza gala that we were having before. So these are all issues that are much, much bigger that we're going to have to be thinking about for years to come. And I don't know the answer, but I do think that is going to be some combination between those two things. But I do think that what we will be seeing is that people won't be as interested in everything being remote and everything being virtual. I think we're going to land somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Now, noting that you both started out at the Foundation Center, look back at yourself just a few years back when you started the Foundation Center. Imagine that you're launching into a fundraising career in this world. How would you possibly advise someone who's just entering into the field to think about the types of skills they should be building and the way to create a pathway for themselves in such uncertainty?
I would advise that relationships are still at the core, even as there is talk of, artificial intelligence and modernizing and digitizing things. You're never going to be able to replace the ability of a fundraising professional to build a relationship with a funder and to utilize that in-person relationship to bring in contributions.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well. That is still absolutely the most important skill that a fundraiser needs. And I would say going a little bit beyond that is understanding really the power dynamics behind that, why foundations fund certain things, what the exchange is, with some of those interests that who gets funded and who doesn't, and why things are important, funding interests at any given time. I think that that's important. So there's a lot of politics to philanthropy and a lot of politics to fundraising that don't necessarily get openly spoken about, especially early in your career. And I think being able to understand that and not take that personally is probably an underrated skill.
Yeah, I think you both tapped into something that's also broadly applicable in today's world, which is, this has certainly accelerated the look at which, maybe the rate of change around considering how human interactions can look like in the future. But this is happening in almost every industry, and sort of moving back to the parts of work that are fundamentally human and can't be replicated with with a machine does tend to take us farther and give us a greater pathway to develop ourselves and develop our careers. We talked a little bit at the beginning, just being mindful of time here. If you do have questions, please do drop them in the chat. We're getting close to the time when we can definitely answer them, and we'll try to go as they come in. But maybe before, to give everyone a few minutes to think of any additional questions they have. Each of us is involved in the unfunded list, and I think, from our perspective also as fundraisers, can you each share a tip to unfunded list evaluators on how they can give some of the best feedback to organizations? Maybe share some feedback that you've received in the past that you found particularly helpful or insightful, or just general thoughts on what type of feedback is most helpful.
I would say don't focus as much on, of course, it's important that the proposal has good grammar and is factually accurate and compelling. That goes without saying, but really focus on what matters to the foundation. That is what foundations fund, whether it has to do with whatever relationships they have or whatever priorities they have. It could be a perfect proposal, but if it's just not compelling to them and something that they care about, it doesn't matter. And all of those efforts to make this a perfect proposal would probably be time better spent on making it the perfect proposal for them and making it compelling for them. And if it isn't compelling for them, finding your fit. It's like dating.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's always two sides to the equation. And I think, often when we're reviewing a proposal, we're focused on the proposal itself, but as you're noting, it's, it's the fit that's the other side. I often talk to the social entrepreneurs that I work with, and encourage them not to be focused on the solution, but to get obsessed about the problem. Because then if they're really obsessed about the problem, they're going to find the solution. They're going to figure it out. And similarly, if you understand what you can offer, you can do some incredible research to find an organization that also cares about that. Sarah, any reflections from your involvement in the Unfunded List on great feedback that evaluators can give?
Yeah, so I have experience on both sides, both as an evaluator and as submitting proposals for Mary Center. And I would say the best feedback we've received is actually from the evaluators who take the time to say, we're happy to hop on a call with you and talk you through this. And the reason why this is so effective for us is because I'm able to loop my program staff into those calls, and having that personal touch point with the evaluator where they can really talk us through what they're seeing and where those opportunities are to improve the proposal. It just has more of an impact hearing it from an actual person than reading it in a report. So we really appreciate the evaluators who take the time to meet with us and to speak to us.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I haven't seen any new questions come into the chat. So I'm going to assume that that everyone's still really thinking hard. I've got a couple more questions that are on my mind that I'd love to get your perspectives on. I think I think one that comes to me, especially when I reflect on what's been just a batty year and a half, is how you've been able to work with your boards through a period like this. I think, it comes up in a lot of governance conversations and other things like that, and if you talk about nonprofits generally, everybody talks about boards, but boards are a really, really incredible part, I think, of any development director's, sort of toolbox, if you will, or, some of the different mechanisms that we can use to help expand our networks. I mean, in a time when we weren't meeting new people easily, how did your boards, how did you effectively utilize your boards and make it so that you were able to leverage, that part of your organization?
They just really stepped up as fundraisers. We have a great board. They're a working board. They're really, really hands-on as far as their commitment of time and their commitment financially and as fundraisers. So they just rallied together and got us through this.
Did you use just one-on-one checkpoints with people? Were you sort of bringing together, were you participating more actively in board meetings or convening a subcommittee? It
was a little bit of both. I mean, for some board members, we have more like one-on-one phone conversations and emails. I've always been a big believer that board meetings are really just to go over business. It's not, board meetings aren't working meetings. So the committees are where the work gets done. So there's the committee meetings where we have gotten a lot of the business done, but it's mostly that, they stepped up, and then the board meetings themselves were where we reported and brought everybody up to speed.
So for us, we have a development committee of the board that helps to oversee and advise on our fundraising efforts. And they were really supportive throughout all of last year and guiding us through the crisis. There are also many of our board members help with thank you calls to donors. So really going above and beyond to acknowledge our supporters for the contributions that they make. And I think it really helps to make our supporters feel, welcome and heard, that they have that special touch point of being contacted by one of our board members.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We've got a question. It's lengthy, but Dave is flagging that the author of Nonprofit AF and philanthropy critic Uli calls grant proposals antiquated and pointless, and wants to move to a more responsive philanthropy that does not rely on proposals. Dave, though, thinks that the opportunity to make a unique case for an organization is valuable, and is interested to know, would we like to see proposals eliminated, or do we like the fact that that we can write proposals, make a case for ourselves, and sometimes get feedback on how we could possibly position ourselves for the future?
I would like to see proposals shortened. What I really enjoy and what I think is effective is having a phone call with a funder, really getting an understanding of where their interests and their priorities lie, figuring out how that aligns with how my team wants to advance our work, and then putting together just a 1 or 2 page write-up articulating what we might be able to achieve in partnership with them. I think that's a really effective way of working together, of making our case. It allows us to really be thoughtful about what we can bring to the table and how we can bring our interests together, but it's also not asking us to write like a 50-page document, which can be very onerous and difficult.
Right. I would say that some proposal formats I've seen are antiquated. Not all, but some certainly are. I don't think I would say proposals are pointless. The point is hopefully to get money and to share information about the foundation. So I wouldn't say that I'd like to see them eliminated. There are certainly sometimes that I'd like to see them changed. There have been some grant proposal applications that I would like to see changed. And I know that we're talking about private philanthropy today, but absolutely, without a doubt, I've worked on some government grant proposals that were an absolute nightmare. And I would love to see those changed. And I'm sure that I'm not alone in that sentiment.
Yeah, I'll just briefly chime in that I would welcome the changes that you're both advocating for. At the same time, I would be interested to see something like the elimination of proposals, but there's a lot of other things that would need to change to enable that, right? Right now, organizations are sort of categorized by a very very broad sets of criteria and sort of tags. I'll share from my experience. We're an organization that works around social entrepreneurship, around youth leadership development. It's sort of where education and business and youth come together, along with all of the issues that go with that. And it doesn't really sit in a category. And when you are talking about something where you're like eliminating proposals, the whole framework for selecting and finding organizations is effectively going to be keyword based.
Yeah.
If you do that. So the criteria just changes, and I think it will lead to greater invisibility for organizations that are doing important work that intersects across multiple areas, which would be I think a terrible thing, because often those organizations, small as they may be, provide some sort of connective tissue that's important to holding the fabric of the whole together. So I like the idea of that, right? Or of a, sort of like developing a points-based system where organizations just do certain things and make themselves eligible for grants. Things like that, I think, are really interesting. But they're all interesting in a very abstract and I think a different world than we actually live in. So that's my take on it. We are coming close to time. If anyone has a very short question, Sarah here with a quick one. I've been hearing from some foundation officers during the pandemic who expressed they've been wanting to hear more communication from nonprofits they fund as they have more availability recently. Do you have suggestions on how to maximize this and create engagement that is meaningful, more individualized connections to students impacted by their grants and or exposure to the greater community with a more diverse audience? I think we talked about this some earlier. I think we all use some mode of this, but have you had any particularly creative mechanisms for creating these touch points?
I provide pretty regular updates, and it's not really planned. It's pretty organic. It's more if we have a success story or a news article or a blog or just something really showcasing the impact that we're having in the community, I'll reach out to the funders in my portfolio and share that with them. And just to give a tangible example of that, we recently featured some of our providers on a very brief podcast series about behavioral health and some of the different programs that we offer. And I shared that with a number of funders and got some very, very positive responses to that.
Yeah, well, I think, Ashley, unless you got a super quick one, I think that's about all we've got time for.
I'm good.
All right. Well, Sarah, Ashley, thank you so much for leading us through this conversation. It's a brave new world we're heading into, perhaps old in some ways, but more new, I think, than we may expect. So appreciate your thoughts and perspective. And with that, I'll wrap this session and pass it back to the Unfunded List team. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. That was terrific. You guys are very smart, and I bet bet that helps you with the money raising. Thanks very much. We will break for an hour. I believe this was the last session that will be broadcast here in the hub. Thanks very much for having us here. We will have the process audit at 4 o'clock, followed by a Q&A with some of our co-review partners. Thanks again for joining us. I like all three of you very much. Thank you for all of the reviews and the proposals you've sent in and all the great work you do. And also, George, thanks for showing off, those great wood beams you've got in your house. And also, I just want to let you know, you do have a light bulb out, I think. Or maybe, I'm not really sure.
It's not turned on, but.
Oh, gotcha. It was bothering me the whole session, just so you know.
Okay, I'll break out the ladder later.
But it was the only thing that bothered me, and with me, that's all that you did a very good job. So good job. Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody learned a lot, and we'll see everybody for the process audit at 4. Thank you.